James Carter had lived in his quiet suburban neighborhood for nearly 20 years. A retired Army veteran, he valued the peace and stability of his home, where mornings meant coffee on the porch and evenings ended with the sight of his American flag waving proudly in the breeze. For James, that flag was more than cloth and stitching. It was a symbol of sacrifice, service, and resilience. But one afternoon, as he sorted through his mail, he came across a letter that made his blood boil. It was a violation notice from the Homeowners Association. In bold letters, the board declared that his flag was non-compliant with community standards and ordered him to remove it immediately. If he failed to comply, the HOA threatened daily fines of $100, eventually escalating to liens against his property. James was stunned. His flagpole was properly installed, secured, and well-maintained. The flag itself was regulation size, clean, and displayed respectfully. He had seen countless homes across the country flying the same symbol, yet his neighborhood's board had singled him out. According to their reasoning, the flag disrupted uniformity and was not an approved decoration. At first, James thought there must be some mistake, but a walk through the neighborhood told him otherwise. Seasonal wreaths hung from doors, decorative lights lined porches, and yard ornaments were scattered across lawns. None of those were uniform, yet no one else had been sighted. His flag, it seemed, had become the board's target. The HOA president, a sharp-tongued woman named Cheryl, was well known for her strict interpretation of the rules. She claimed the flagpole violated aesthetic guidelines and refused to listen when neighbors spoke up in James's defense. Her stance was firm: remove the flag or pay the fines. James wasn't about to surrender. He had faced tougher battles than this, and he knew his rights. But he also knew how HOAs operated. They thrived on intimidation, relying on homeowners to fold under pressure. Most people paid the fines quietly rather than risk escalating conflict. James, however, wasn't most people. He began documenting everything. He photographed his flagpole, collected copies of the violation notices, and compared them to the vague language in the HOA's bylaws. He spoke with neighbors, several of whom admitted they too had been pressured into compliance over minor issues, from garden gnomes to mailbox colors. A pattern emerged. The board exercised power arbitrarily, bending the rules whenever it suited them. But the more James researched, the more he realized something critical. State law, not just HOA bylaws, protected his right to fly the flag. He discovered a statute explicitly forbidding homeowners associations from banning the display of the American flag, provided it was flown in a respectful manner. The HOA's demands weren't just unfair, they were illegal. Armed with this knowledge, James prepared for battle. He wasn't going to simply defend himself. He was going to expose the board's overreach for the entire neighborhood to see. What began as a single violation notice was about to turn into a confrontation that would shake the HOA to its core. James Carter was no stranger to conflict, but this battle was different. Instead of camouflage and rifles, he was armed with statutes, paperwork, and a determination sharpened by years of discipline. The violation notice had been meant to intimidate him, but all it did was light a fire. He wasn't just offending a flag. He was standing against the creeping control of an HOA that believed it could rewrite the law at will. The first step was preparation. James spent days researching every clause in the HOA's bylaws, cross-referencing them against the state's property and housing laws. He highlighted sections, marked inconsistencies, and compiled a folder that grew thicker by the hour. At the heart of it was a key discovery, a state law that specifically guaranteed the right of residents to fly the United States flag, provided it was displayed respectfully. The law even noted that HOAs could not override that right under the guise of aesthetic standards. Next, James reached out to a veterans advocacy group in his area. They confirmed his interpretation of the statute and offered their support. They had seen cases like his before, boards trying to push homeowners around, banking on ignorance and fear. But with state law on his side and a network of veterans willing to back him, James knew he had the strength to fight. The next HOA board meeting was a perfect stage. Residents gathered in the community center, many unaware of the brewing conflict. The board, led by Cheryl, carried themselves with a usual air of authority, ready to list off violations and impose fines as if reading from a script. But when James rose, holding his folder of documents, the atmosphere shifted. He began with facts. Calmly, methodically, he laid out the timeline. The violation notice, the threat of daily fines, the demand to remove his flag. Then he unveiled the state statute, reading aloud the exact wording that protected his right. Eyes widened in the crowd, and whispers rippled across the room. Many homeowners had no idea such protections even existed. Cheryl tried to interject, insisting that the HOA's community standards overruled individual preferences. But James was ready. He reminded everyone that state law superseded HOA bylaws, no matter how strict the board believed itself to be. He presented copies of legal opinions and prior cases where associations had been forced back down under similar circumstances. The room's energy began to shift in his favor. And then came the turning point. James revealed that he had already filed a formal complaint with the state housing authority, attaching the HOA's violation notices as evidence. If the board continued to enforce the fine, not only would it be struck down, but the HOA itself could face penalty for unlawful practices. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Neighbors who had once been silent now leaned forward, intrigued. Many had suffered under arbitrary fines themselves, and James's defiance gave them hope. For the first time in years, the board looked rattled. Cheryl's composure faltered. She tried to redirect the meeting, but it was too late. James had made his point clear. The HOA could either back down voluntarily, or they would be forced into a legal battle they had little chance of winning. By the time the meeting ended, the board had agreed to review the matter further. But James knew what that meant. They were scrambling, trying to figure out how to save face. What they didn't realize was that the damage had already been done. Their authority had cracked, and the neighborhood had seen it happen. The days following the board meeting were unusually quiet. For once, no new violation notices appeared in mailboxes. No patrols of clipboard-wielding committee members circled the neighborhood with watchful eyes. It was as if the HOA had retreated into silence, hoping the storm would pass unnoticed. But storms, as James knew well, only grew stronger when ignored. Within a week, the State Housing Authority responded to James's complaint. Their letter was firm and unambiguous. The HOA's attempt to fine him for displaying the American flag was unlawful. The notice ordered the association to cease enforcement immediately and warned that further action could result in penalties against the board itself. James didn't have to say a word. The ruling spoke louder than anything he could have written. News traveled fast. Copies of the state's decision made their way from house to house, slipped under doors and shared over fences. For years, residents had whispered about the HOA's overreach, about arbitrary fines for garden decorations, paint colors, or even children's toys left outside. But until James's case, no one had successfully stood up to them. His victory was proof that the board wasn't untouchable. Neighbors began approaching James on his evening walks, thanking him quietly, some with relief in their voices. Others asked for advice on their own disputes, emboldened by his success. Slowly, the culture of fear the HOA had cultivated began to unravel. Where once people kept their heads down, they now began questioning rules openly, no longer intimidated by threats of fines. Cheryl and the board tried to spin the outcome. They claimed it was a misinterpretation of the rules, insisting the association had only been trying to maintain order. But the neighborhood wasn't buying it. Too many had seen the arrogance with which the violation was delivered. Too many had heard James's clear explanation backed by state law. The board's credibility was fractured, and once trust is broken, it cannot easily be repaired. Not long after, a petition began circulating, this time not from the board, but from the homeowners themselves. It called for new elections, for a fresh start, for leaders who understood that rules should serve the community, not oppress it. The petition spread quickly, signatures piling up faster than anyone expected. Cheryl and her allies suddenly found themselves on the defensive, faced with a movement they could not suppress. By the following month, the board had been reshuffled. Several members, including Cheryl, resigned under pressure, while others were voted out entirely. In their place, new representatives stepped forward, people chosen not for their strictness but for their willingness to listen. The transformation was slow, but undeniable. The HOA was no longer feared, but held accountable. Through it all, James kept his flag flying. Bright and steady, it became a symbol of modern patriotism. To his neighbors, it represented defiance against overreach, a reminder that authority has limits, and that even a single homeowner could make a difference when armed with knowledge and determination. The irony was not lost on him. The board had tried to force him into silence, but in doing so, they had amplified his voice. They had attempted to shame him, only to humiliate themselves. And the patch of lawn where his flagpole stood, once at the center of conflict, now marked the beginning of change for the entire community. The HOA had wanted to make an example of James. In the end, they had succeeded, just not in the way they intended.